So now, in this lecture, we need to talk about the dynamic heart in context. Okay? So you might recall that in everything, we're always thinking about how the heart is responding. So we could sort of draw arrows out. That's what we've been talking about thus far. Now we're shifting gears a little bit to ask the question, how does the surrounding context affect the response of the heart, those responses? So, context, back to this phrasing, context and response. You're always thinking of the interplay between context and response. And what I mean by response is that the dynamic functions of your heart are expressing themselves. So response just is summary form of what we've been talking about. Now we're going to shift gears and talk about how does context put shape to that? Because that is vital to understand in counseling. In fact, maybe the easiest way to sort of zoom out and again summarize what biblical counseling is you're always thinking about the context-response dynamic in light of God's concerns in His Word. And so let me just segue into this. Let me introduce this topic by just asking a question. What makes an alcoholic an alcoholic? What are the things that you hear often? Okay? What are some things? So, what makes an alcoholic an alcoholic? You often hear, my father was an alcoholic. Okay? And by that, they can mean one of two things, okay? They can kind of mean it as, my father was an alcoholic, so that means it's hereditary. There's a bodily reality to it. There's a genetic predisposition for it, okay? You'll hear that a lot. And here's the other thing you'll hear a lot from that is that my father was an alcoholic, which means it was sort of modeled for me. I'm just imitating him. And so even in that one statement, my father was an alcoholic, so I'm an alcoholic, there can kind of be this dual recognition of nature and nurture, of who I am and where I was, what the conditions were around me. Okay? Anybody else worked with alcoholics or have alcoholism in their family, or somebody who's always getting drunk? Other elements of this? Yeah, oftentimes it starts with tragedy, okay? Tragedy, where something terrible happens. The loss of a child. A really ugly divorce. And someone then is provoked to seek relief in alcohol, okay? Often a tragedy can be part of it, okay? Sometimes it's this idea of there's the social element. My friends like to party, and my friends always create this environment where we get drunk all the time, and that's just part of how I live my life and how I conceive of fun and things like that. There can be a social element to it, okay? There's lots of different things that we could say here. As Christians, okay, with a biblical framework of understanding, we never want to move away entirely from the category of a person's an alcoholic because they're in some way choosing to drink alcohol. There is agency involved. No one is making them do it by taking over their body and forcing them to make choices that they're kicking and screaming and trying not to make. They're making those choices, okay? And so, so I forgot to mention habit, okay? We'll get into that. But my point is, when we mention sin, how do we understand it in light of all these other things? Well, that's where this paradigm is helpful, because sin is something we would posit as part of a response to a context. And all these other things are something we would put in the context. Outside of the heart's response, it's contextual. And understanding both the difference between the two and the interplay between the two is essential for you being good counselors. Because we can never stray from attention to the heart's response as the primary thing that Scripture wants us to pay attention to. That's where God wants to do His change, in the response of the heart. We are not apologetic for that. In fact, it's unmerciful to someone to focus only on the contextual factors, as if merely changing their context will change their heart. It won't do it. So we focus rightly on the response part of it, but we also don't dismiss the context. How can I say that with a biblical anthropology? Well, here's how we understand this, right? All of these things, if he did have a father who was alcoholic, now, whether we would grant or not a particular genetic predisposition to an individual, even if we did grant that as a possibility of some bodily inclination that makes them more likely to be an alcoholic than someone else, okay? And even if we granted them too this modeling, this father that they watched for years and years and years, when stress would come, he would deal with it by getting drunk. When the weekend would come, he would live in a stupor. Instead of engaging with the family, he would give himself over to these things. You've seen families torn apart with it. Those models can be tragic. We can grant that as an important contextual factor of why he's responding the way he is. Same thing with tragedy. Same thing with the social relationships around him. And even his bodily habits, the conditions of his body, become part of the context out of which his heart is responding. So my point to you is we always have to maintain an understanding of the distinction between the two, and we want to focus on the spiritual response of the heart, but we have to do that in such a way where we're recognizing the contextual factors that put shape to that, so that we can have the right amount of compassion as well as the right amount of insight into what their heart's actually doing. What's their heart actually responding to? I think I've made a lot of mistakes in my counseling over the years, especially early. I think I've made a lot of mistakes by not paying adequate attention to the conditions out of which a person is responding. I have laid very heavy burdens on telling people to not be anxious, and maybe even moving towards a rebuke of their anxiety without really understanding the remarkable amount of pressure that's on them. Now, ultimately, I do think God can help them to have peace in any and every circumstance. We know that from Philippians. But what my point to you is that I didn't adequately help them understand what their hearts were responding to in the particularities, and so I was less effective with them in counseling. So, what makes an alcoholic an alcoholic? Well, ultimately, it's because the heart is always inclined to seek God in something else other than God, okay? In this case, any substance or like alcohol. But we have to also adequately weigh the contextual factors that lead into that. So, paying attention to how the heart is shaped by the things that surround it is a vital aspect of this theology of human experience that we're building and of the counseling task. People respond to the hardships of life, the circumstances into which they are born, even the climate of their location that they were born. They believe certain things about themselves based on what other people around them say about them or the ways that they treat them, incidents that have happened. Their perception of God is shaped by what other people say or don't say about God. We were made to be influenced and influencing beings. We were made to be both influenced by what surrounds us and to be part of what surrounds other people as an influencer. That's how God made us. That's what our relationality is in that sense. My point is that the heart was designed to be influenced by everything around it, and understanding that fact is vital to help people understand their own heart's responses, their own experience. And that's part of this task, the hope of connecting their experience to Christ, to who He is and what He can do to change them. So the goal of this lecture, like the chapter, is to consider the context of relationships and situations that shape a person's response. By recognizing these influences, we're better equipped to move them from a passive receiver who's merely influenced to an active responder who processes that experience through the Word of God by the power of the Spirit, independence of who God is, and then responds in a way that is shaped by and conforms to Him. So, I want to talk about a trajectory that's in the book. You also see there in your notes. This trajectory of how we understand it. Because this isn't always clear. If I just draw arrows going in on the influence and then arrows going out to talk about the response, that doesn't zoom in as much as we need to understand just how the two interplay, just how the two interrelate. So that's why we have this other diagram. Okay? So let's think of it this way. You can kind of think of external conditions. This is the wider circle that I have in blue right here. You can think of first of external conditions. External conditions are the contextual factors that create the ideal state for a particular internal response. Okay? So what I mean by that is the conditions are external to an individual's determination. They didn't choose it, they didn't make it, they didn't bring it about. And so we have to understand those as happening to them or given to them. They're not from them, they're to them. Okay? And so these external circumstances create conditions that make a certain response more likely. So, if you are at a coffee shop and someone taps you on the shoulder in line behind you and you turn and they punch you in the face, okay? That is an external condition that will put shape to how you respond. How you respond is now necessarily in relationship to that punch to the face. And so you can imagine how you would feel in that moment. The immediate response of how you would feel. Eventually, hopefully, by faith, you would get a grip of yourself, but at least your immediate response would be one of a quickened heartbeat. It would probably be this mixture of anger, alarm, maybe some fear, and probably a lot of confusion. Okay? Now, what if somebody in line at Starbucks tapped you on the shoulder and you turn around and he slips a Starbucks gift card into your hand? Okay? That is a different set of external circumstances that create the ideal state, the ideal environment for a different set of responses to be shaped. Okay? So you're probably not going to feel anger and confusion and fear or whatever we said for the last one. What you're most likely going to experience, you might still be confused, but you're also going to experience a happy confusion. You're going to experience some kind of sense that what they're doing is good. You will evaluate it that way. And so what I'm saying is there are things that happen to us that then move in a trajectory. Okay? And then you'll notice in the diagram that I have my sort of the heart shape. You have the dynamic responses of the heart. But you have two categories that kind of hover within, right? You first have this moving towards passive dynamic effects. which then moves towards active dynamic response. The key terms to pay attention to there are passive versus active and effects versus response. Passive dynamic effects, what I mean is the imprint that the external condition has on the shape of the heart. The beliefs, the values, and the intentions. Okay? They're passive in the sense that the external circumstance exerts itself onto people, and it draws their attentions to particular things and shapes their perceptions in particular ways. So for instance, a child growing up in poverty will necessarily have a different perspective of different beliefs about money, a different emotional response to receiving food. They're even going to act in different ways as it relates to work or success or other things because of the likelihood of it yielding change or resulting in anything. Their perceptions are going to largely be different when they are growing up in extreme poverty that's sort of inescapable in that sense. These external conditions will necessarily have an imprint on their perceptions. You know, I think of Matthew 18:6 as a really good biblical defense of what I'm trying to say here, how the things that happen outside us have a necessary effect upon us, and especially regarding children, where Jesus says, "Whoever causes one of these little ones who believes in me to sin, it would be better for him to have a great millstone fastened around his neck and that he be drowned in the sea." So that Jesus' language is whoever causes one of these little ones to sin. Oh, time out, Jesus. Sin is actually always comes from the agency of the individual, so you actually can't cause somebody else to sin. So sorry to be your theological editor, but I just had to point that out. No, Jesus knew that. He was speaking idiomatically, recognizing the power of one person to influence another, especially when there's a divergence of power there. There's a little bit of a dynamic there. So my point there is simply Jesus is even recognizing one can act in such a way that creates the ideal conditions for a child to sin in response. This is exactly what Paul gets at when he says, of the few things he says about parenting, it's fathers, don't provoke your children to wrath or to discouragement. Well, how does that make sense without an understanding like this? That he's saying the father can act in such a way where a certain response is provoked out of their child. So have you ever seen a father badger his children again and again and again? Have you ever seen a father just be utterly displeased with everything that happens and be impatient? What effect does it have on the children? It makes them think about themselves in certain ways. It makes them think about the world in certain ways. It makes them anxious and fearful in certain ways. I think it even has implications of the way they perceive God, especially if that father is like that and also talks to them about God. And it can just be this really awful, destructive thing. But there's hope, right? Because what I'm saying here with this model is that the way we are treated, or the external conditions, they only have passive dynamic effects. It's not determinative. It's influencing. It's shaping, but it's not determinative then of the active dynamic response. So, just before I get to active dynamic response, the implication of what I'm saying here is how we're treated in childhood, for instance, doesn't necessarily determine lock, stock, and barrel inalterably how I'm going to respond as an adult. But we're foolish to think that there's not a significant influence on how I respond as an adult, because there's a significant influence on how I perceive the world what I believe about it, the things that I want to it or emotionally respond to it, and even the actions that I've taken as a pattern. Okay, so it's not determinative, but it is very influential. So that moves us towards active dynamic response. That's simply everything else we've been talking about here. It moves from something that's passively imprinted on me to then something I actively cooperate with. I actively that actively flows out of me. Okay. So let's apply this with an example. Okay. There's a big difference between the external condition of being cut off in traffic by some jerk who just gets right in front of you, and being stuck in traffic and then being hauled out of your car by a carjacker who throws you to the ground, who grabs your wallet or your purse off of you, kicks you to make sure that you don't get up, gets in your vehicle that you spend hard-earned money to get, and then drives off. A carjacking and getting cut off in traffic are two different levels of extremity of the external condition. And so the level of extremity here determines the level of imprint here. So if you get cut off, it's a lot easier for you to control your active dynamic response immediately, or to gain control of it is a better way to say it, than if you were carjacked. I mean, probably all of you in here have been cut off at some point. It's infuriating. When I was a teenager, I would trail the guy like a moron. Thankfully, I'm less of a moron now. But I don't know if anybody in here has been carjacked. I've never been carjacked, but I could imagine what the experience of being left out there, abandoned in the middle of a street with somebody driving off with things that are mine. You can imagine the emotional impact that has. And maybe every time I come back to that intersection, or maybe the next time I see someone who looks or has the same type of look that the person who carjacked me is, there's going to be this gut reaction, this fear response that sort of shows the passive dynamic effect in that sense. So my point here is, the greater the extremity of the effect, of the condition, usually the greater the extremity of the effect. So we listen to the stories of people in order to understand the conditions that they're coming from in particular. So this is how we counsel well. You know, in the book, I give an extended example of one of the first times it's really started to dawn on me, okay, is when my oldest daughter was very young, and I was busy working on stuff, and my wife wanted to get away and go see her parents. They live in Indiana in the middle of these beautiful farms, and there's a horse farm that they live next to, and it's mini horses. They're not ponies, they're actually mini horses, okay? They think they're adorable and cute. I despise them, okay? But the point is, we always tell our kids, hey, when you're Papa and Mimi's, you do not climb the fence and go over into the corral with the horses. I know they're mini, I know they're cute, but we don't know what they're going to do, and they're a heck of a lot bigger than you are. So they know that they are not to go there. Now, the thing about my oldest daughter is she is a rule keeper, okay? She grew up loving rules, okay? Sometimes that was a very good thing. Sometimes that was a very self-righteous thing. But the point is, she loves order, she loves rule. The kid just obeys, okay? So I get a phone call. So my wife goes up with the kids without me. I'm home working. I get a phone call one day, and it's my wife, and she says, we're in a dilemma. I don't know what I should do in this parenting moment. Allie went into the corral with the horses, and I think I need to punish her, but there's a whole story to it, and we're just trying to figure out what to do. And the grandparents and the uncles and aunts are all around, and it's just this big thing. And basically I said, okay, tell me what happened. Well, basically my kids were out playing, my daughter Allie was out playing, and they were perfectly content to chase butterflies in their own yard and all the rest of the stuff. And then along come some cooler, older cousins who grow up in that area, and they're just comfortable with horses, and they're comfortable outside, and they do all this stuff, and they say, Allie, come on, let's climb the fence. And Allie says, no, I can't do that. You know, Daddy said not to. Come on, Allie, let's climb the fence. We won't get in trouble. We won't tell. No, I can't do that. Come on, Allie, we do this all the time. We know what we're doing. No, Daddy said no, I don't want to do that. Allie, I thought you were my friend. And then Allie, that just won her. And Allie climbed the fence and got to the other side. And this is hilarious. She said she set her foot on the other side of the fence and immediately felt alarmed and climbed back over and ran to the house and told Mom what she did. Okay, so the dilemma is, do you punish Allie for that? Okay, well, it's a perfect illustration of this, because we ended up punishing Allie. Okay, but here's how we did it, though, just so you don't think I'm a terrible person. Okay, here's how we did it. We said, sweetheart, you climbed the fence, and that was your disobedience. You did that. No one can make you do that. You chose to do that. Now, sweetheart, I also want to acknowledge that had your cousins not come in that moment, I believe fully that you would not have climbed that fence. But to then say that the cause of you climbing the fence was your cousins is exactly wrong. Your cousins were only the condition, and I didn't get fancy with her, I promise, about external conditions, and I didn't get into this. But I just said, your cousins were only the occasion or the condition that brought out what was inside your heart. And we walked through the conversation that led to her climbing the fence. And I said, sweetheart, what it boils down to was, in that moment, you were wanting to show your cousins that you're a good friend to them more than you were wanting to obey your daddy, who's trying to protect you and keep you safe. And by extension, obeying God, because God tells you to obey your daddy. So that's why you're being punished. But I'm also recognizing that I don't think you would have climbed that fence on your own. So let's just thank God that this was an occasion where we can understand a little bit more about what's going on inside us. And hopefully, she probably forgot all about that, I don't know. But hopefully that's a step towards her understanding herself in relation to who God is. So that's what I mean by all that. Now, that's a sweet little example of mini horses and little girls running around in butterfly-filled fields. But my point is that But my point is that this is the same dynamic that goes on in a much more complex way in the counseling situations that we see. You can cut this long pause out for me if you make a note for that. I lost my spot. Okay, you ready? So it gets a lot more complex in counseling. And at the end of this chapter, I introduce to you the four main contexts that surround and influence the heart, okay? We're going to talk about this together, but the four main contexts are God, self, others, and then circumstances. Circumstances. These all function as external conditions. So that's what we're going to launch into in the next couple chapters that we have, or next couple lectures that we have. But prior to that, there's also something that we need to acknowledge, okay? We need to acknowledge, let me get rid of this now so it's not overly burdened here. We need to acknowledge that as the heart responds to these external factors, we also have to acknowledge that we do so as embodied beings, okay? So far, I've talked to you about the fact that we function spiritually in this dynamic way, and I did it with this illustration. But I haven't yet illustrated the fact that this occurs within the body. It occurs as human beings who are made in the image of God to be both spiritual in their response but also physical. Okay? So, the term that theologians use for this is that we are psychosomatic unities. Psyche, soul, soma, body. We are body, soul unities. What I mean by that is this. The functions of the heart that we've been talking about and the functions of the body, specifically our neurological pathways firing electrically, the functions of the spiritual heart and the functions of the physical body, they correlate. They're correlative. What that means is when one functions, the other functions. Okay? So when I say a word or think a thought or have a desire, there is some physiological framework firing in my brain. Different parts of my brain are going on, which then brings order and direction to what I do with my body. It's all interrelated. Then you throw in the complexity of the hormonal system, the complexity of cardiovascular and muscular and skeletal and all the rest of the stuff in addition to the nervous system, and it is just remarkably complex. Okay? But for now, what I want to acknowledge is that we are embodied, and that's part of the external conditions in one sense that we're talking about in this lecture. And just so you know, if I were to diagram the body, where would I put it in the spiritual function of the heart? I think the best I've been able to come up with is the body is like the board itself, the whiteboard. If the whiteboard were not here, I would not have been able to diagram the spiritual functions of the heart. And so the whiteboard is the necessary platform on which I was able to diagram the spiritual functions of the heart. I think that's a great illustration for how the body and the soul relate. And here's further evidence for that. Okay? Imagine for a second that this whiteboard were not the beautiful, cleaned, pristine whiteboard that it is. It's relatively new. It's put together well. Imagine if it was one of like the first whiteboards ever created. Okay? And I don't know when whiteboards were made. Let's pretend it's the 70s or 80s. I don't know. But it's 30 some odd years old. Okay? You ever seen an old whiteboard? It's not white. It's like this yellowy, gross color. Okay? You ever seen a whiteboard that has had too much moisture in it? It sort of warps and gets wavy, and then it cracks certain ways. Imagine if we had a damaged whiteboard like that, and then I took my dry erase marker and I tried to draw the same diagram. What would the diagram look like? Well, it wouldn't be nearly as pretty as this one, right? My ability to draw accurately and neatly that diagram is affected by the fact that the board itself is broken. So that's my attempt to illustrate for you that we have to help people think through what are their embodied conditions, because there are certain aspects of their bodies that work right according to God's design originally. And then there are certain aspects of their bodies that may not work right, that might be broken. And what I'm saying here is just an implication of our hamartiology, our doctrine of sin. That sin corrupts the soul, as we went over in a couple lectures back, but sin also corrupts the physical creation. It's cursed. And part of the physical creation is our bodies. Okay? So, I'm not saying we need to buy every diagnostic scheme of every disorder that's in the DSM-5 or anything like that. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is this. It fits within a Christian theological vision of the world to acknowledge the possibility of broken embodied conditions, including the brain. And that will have an effect upon the shape of the spiritual response, much like in the diagram that I just erased. So, it's important to pay attention to embodied conditions as you're counseling and caring for people. So just the three subcategories I list there briefly are age, personality, and mental and physiological capacities. So for age, the physical condition of the board is going to be different for a 13-year-old boy versus a 93-year-old boy or man at that point. Okay? You have to think about the same Bible applies to both of them in terms of walking in dignity, possessing your vessel with self-control like one who knows God. Okay? That applies to a 93-year-old and it applies to a 13-year-old, but I'm telling you it applies in a very different way because of the different embodied conditions. A 13-year-old's body is doing things that a 93-year-old body is no longer doing, right? He is emerging into his manhood. His hormones are going crazy. He's struggling with energies and thoughts and new experiences that he's never had before, and helping him with all the potentiality of what he's emerging into is very different than helping a 93-year-old whose bodily conditions those aren't his struggles. His struggles are that his body is incapable of the things that it once was, from chewing to walking to being able to think clearly. And so helping him to exercise self-control is a very different thing. It's a different type of self-control that's expressed in that bodily condition than in the 13-year-old one. So age is a really important thing, and along with age, by the way, is sort of stage, age and stage, right? So there's a difference between someone who is young and under another person's care versus someone who emerges into adulthood is caring for him or herself, and then maybe getting married and having children, or continuing in singleness but with increasing responsibilities towards other people, different lots in life. There's age and stage considerations. Also, the other category is personality. You know, I'm not trying to baptize any particular personality theory because all of them are based on assumptions, some of which I think are helpful and accurate, but many of which are inaccurate and faulty. And so whether you're talking about Myers-Briggs or the Enneagram, sorry if I'm like slaying a sacred cow in front of you, those things can be helpful descriptions of the style with which you relate to the world, okay? But they don't tell you essentially what's true about you. I have to admit, I sometimes get a little nervous when I hear people say, I took the Enneagram, or I took the Myers-Briggs, or I took this test or that test, and I finally know who I am. I finally understand who I am. And I think, yeah, you understand maybe a little bit more about the patterns of how you respond to the world, but the core and the essence of who you are has not been revealed to you by that. We understand who we are in light of what God says about us primarily in His Word, okay? So when I say personality, I'm really not trying to get you to use personality tests in your counseling necessarily. What I'm trying to get you to see is what all of us can recognize, that every person in this room, if there's 35 or 40 people in the room, there's 35 or 40, maybe 41 or 42 personalities, okay? And what I mean by that is you respond differently than the way you respond differently than the way you would respond to similar situations, just in terms of whether you're more outwardly vocal, whether you're more insecure, or whether you're sort of more task-oriented versus relationally oriented. There's a lot of different things we can do to measure it, but my point is we need to recognize that you as the counselor in the counseling room are not the standard of right response. There are times you have to acknowledge, boy, the way they're responding to this situation is different than the way I would respond, but it's not unbiblical. And so you just have to be careful to recognize differences there, okay? So personality. Then the last one is the most important. That last subcategory is the most important for us to spend a little bit of time just bringing some clarity on. And that's mental and physiological capacities. And here's my attempt. I know it's so unfair with just the ending part of a lecture. But here's my attempt to acknowledge, friends, that there is something we must acknowledge about the fact that our mental structures, our physical structures of our brain, can have conditions that make stable, good responses to the world more difficult than they would be otherwise, okay? So in other words, something can be broken and not function according to God's original design for the neurology, for the neurological function. So a very obvious example of this that everyone would agree with is Down syndrome, for instance. There's an extra chromosome that upon the growth and the development of the individual, it affects everything from their cognitive capacities to the way they respond emotionally to what they're actually physically able to do in carrying things out. And so we would minister to and counsel with someone with Down syndrome in a way that's different from someone who doesn't have Down syndrome and whose functioning might, from the larger perspective, be more in conformity to, physical functioning be more in conformity to what God originally designed prior to the fall, okay? And so it's not that we treat the Down syndrome individual, the individual with Down syndrome, it's not like we treat him as less of a human being, but we just are considerate of the extent of their capacities, okay? Which means we counsel them appropriately. They still are agents, moral agents, living before God as His image bearer. They have far more dignity than any animal could ever hope to have, just like that's true of anybody else functioning in a different way, right? And so we don't treat them with less dignity by treating them like they're not responsible for their actions, but we also recognize the limitations of their capacities. So, I haven't solved the mystery of how we understand the different conditions of what we can, I think, reasonably call mental illness, as long as we understand mental illness not as a biologically determinative category, like if there's something wrong in the brain, then the only solution is to try to fix the brain. That's biological determinism. I think we can reject that and still use terms like mental illness to just simply recognize that there are conditions of the brain that make it far more likely for a person to respond in this particular way than they would otherwise respond if they didn't have that condition. So, how do you get a sense for if there's a mental illness element of this in their embodied conditions as they're responding? Again, we'll need more time for this over the course of all your curriculum here at Southern. But let me just introduce this as a criterion for you. If someone has extreme patterns of mental or emotional or behavioral problems, okay, that seem more outside their control or more random or more extreme, okay, than what the person even can grasp for themselves. So notice I kind of use these categories, but now we're just talking about sort of extreme versions. I think that might be an indication that you should consult some medical help, some professional medically trained people who can help you assess these things. I've been in a number of situations where a counselee has been in either coming right off of or right in the middle of what I think we can reasonably call a psychotic episode. It's a mental break with reality, where they were believing everything from that they were figures in a Bible story to the fact that they were being trained by the CIA for some secret mission through this phone conversation they're having with a friend or something like that, where there is clearly sort of a break from reality, that they're not faking, they're sincere as anything, and there's just these really bizarre swings in emotions and in cognitive interpretations of what's going on. In those cases, I think we serve people well by having them consult with medical doctors. I'm not saying you hand them over to the medical doctor as if through medicine or through medical means that you can solve the spiritual problems. I'm not saying that. I'm saying in cooperation with and in consultation with a doctor. Okay? So, I know there's a lot more I could say there, but that's going to have to do for now. Hopefully the book will clarify this a little bit more, and we certainly will clarify it over the whole course of your curriculum here. So with that, we'll stop, and we will look forward to the next lecture.